Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on episode 12 of The Familiar of Zero, Night of the Twin Moons. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. Now, last we left off, things were grim. Sheffield, invoking the Ring of Andvari, has caused trouble in the, hitherto thought safe city of South Goth, and now, things are hitting the fan. Like, Louise and Saito are on rocky terms, but I feel like that's all kind of water under the bridge now that there's actual, life and limb at risk here. So, really, if Louise knows what's good for her, she's going to find Saito post-haste and, really hope he has the sense to not hold a grudge. Fortunately, however, it seems as though that's well and truly the case, Saito probably didn't exactly kill that guy, which, maybe he should have done, but, I guess it's neither here nor there. Louise is happy to see him, he's happy to see her, both of them still alive and well for the time being. But, whether or not that'll be the case indefinitely remains to be seen, because now Albion forces are marching on the city, so things are about to get real grim real quick. Now, normally during the opening theme, I would sit quietly with reverence, but today I am obligated to my sponsor. Today's sponsor is none other than myself. You may not know this, but I write light novels, and I've written quite a few. Today, I'm going to tell you about the eccentric detective Yamamoto, in which the intrepid, if drunken, detective solves a wide variety of cases with the help of her assistant Satoshi. Ranging from finding missing pets and surveilling cheating spouses to catching a high-end cat burglar and preventing the murder of a local business magnate, no case is too big or too small for Detective Yamamoto. Even when she's forced to work with, and occasionally against, the police, and even when she must contend with her fear of the supernatural, nothing will prevent the eccentric detective from doing what needs to be done to solve the case. If this sounds like something you'd like to read, then by all means, consider purchasing books in the Eccentric Detective Yamamoto series by me, Frederick Fitzgerald, through Amazon. Thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the episode. Now, unfortunately, all of this is sort of recontextualizing the previous episode in a bad sort of way, because, Louise had made a big deal to Saito about how, if the queen demanded it, she would die, and, it seems as though that, the situation's bad enough that death might happen one way or another, I guess my memories of The Familiar of Zero from way back in the day have gotten a little bit muddled because I guess I assumed a lot of what surely must happen in this episode happened over a slightly longer period of time. But I guess the salient point is that Albion is marching on a city previously thought safe. The Queen and everyone else were here by virtue of that Silver Advent Festival, but whether the festival and the holiday are over or Albion is breaking the truce, that sort of remains to be seen, but the salient information is that things are dire indeed. And when you get down to it, Queen Henrietta seems to be making things worse by saying, look, I'm only going to evacuate on the last ship. I mean, I get it. I'm of two minds about it. Because on the one hand, I recognize why she would want to do that. On the other hand, I think the Queen should leave first, her being the most important. Now, Derflinger's already talking about rearguard actions, which are, dangerous. To take a rearguard action is to defend a retreating force and thereby taking all the risk upon yourself. So, I get why Louise would volunteer for such a thing, but the Queen's unaware of this. The Cardinal approached her with the understanding that she would be performing this rearguard action and that it's not an order. So, yeah, here we go then. Louise has essentially signed her own death warrant for the sake of the Queen. It's not an order, and it's not something Saito knew about, nor does Henrietta really know about it either? So, things are really dire. Especially because Louise's reliability as a mage is now in more question than it had been previously, so... what now, right? Like, from Saito's perspective, being bait and dying isn't worth it, but at the same time, he can't exactly countermand Louise. She seems dead set on all this, so... I don't know. I feel like, some slightly underhanded methods might be necessary to resolve everything, So at least Louise is sort of couching this in slightly better terms than merely duty and honor. The idea is that the rearguard action isn't just defending the queen, it's also defending all these civilians and commoners who would be butchered by the invading army. So, in a sense, I get why anyone should want to do it, but at the same time, we don't know much about the rearguard action and what's being planned here. Is it just Louise and Saito who would be holding out against an army? Because, really, that's not a long-term solution, right? Like, it would be one thing if they had, like, a pass or some other form of highly impassable terrain that would allow them to hold off, but, I don't know. As things are pretty darn grim. Louise, to her credit, is willing to sort of relinquish her bond with Saito, saying, like, look, you can live, but that's not really a solution either, You can't expect the guy to abandon her over that. But, yeah, I reckon I know where this is going. With Saito's change in demeanor, like, that cunning rat is planning something, and I reckon I know what it is, Lest we forget, Siesta furnished him with a special little treat just in case, and, I think now's probably the opportune time to use it. I guess the question is, what before then, Like, obviously Saito has a plan, but Louise has a request before that, and... it's a pretty hefty request. I feel like, it's kind of ill-timed, I suppose, on the eve of one's death, but, I guess in her own way, this is Louise trying to do the right thing, I suppose, but, I don't know what exactly she hopes to accomplish here if, she's getting married just for Saito to leave and then for her to die. That's, it's not exactly a good thing, to immediately, leave someone a widower. Oh dear, so I know where this is going with those, flowers. Now, Louise isn't going to explain it, but I think it's, kind of obvious based on the name if you know anything about French, but it's a magic flower, and I reckon it'll stay blooming so long as the person you love is still alive, which, that might come into play, Alright, yeah, so Saito's doing it. He's just gonna slip Louise that sleeping potion and presumably ship her off somewhere safe while he holds things off in the rearguard action. I should hope for his sake that he's not going to be fighting alone, because really, with the Cardinal presenting this rearguard action to Louise as being not in order, it really seems like that these two people are expected to hold off an army, and no matter how you slice it, that's not a tenable thing. Ah, dear. So here we go. Despite Saito not really understanding how weddings work here, Louise can't help but just be a little bit too harsh. I feel like you might afford someone a little bit of grace at a time like this, when it's all but certain that you're about to die. Oh dear. That is probably my one complaint here, The weird thing is, I think I like The Familiar of Zero more than I had done when I watched it originally, but boy, there are some instances where it just rankles. Louise being too uncharitable, And it's not just that she's too uncharitable for her own good, but it's like she's too uncharitable beyond the suspension of disbelief, you know? Because, like, you get to a point where it's like, look, you know, you can be a snobby aristocrat, but, like, you don't have to whip the guy all the time for every little infraction. Of course, you know, in light of this wedding ceremony and the flower blooming and all that, it seems like maybe a lot of the beating is bluster. You know, it's not exactly her true feelings, but I guess regardless of those true feelings, the sleeping potion has taken effect, so I can't help but wonder whether or not they are technically legally married. Because on the one hand, it would be nice, you know, I would appreciate it, but on the other hand, I feel like with the business of Louise being passed off safely to someone else and Saito going off to his death, you know, I can't help but wonder about the legality of the marriage. So, I guess at this point, I can't help but wonder, like, Giulio, he's been playing a strange game, but I feel like ultimately he will do the right thing here to effectively protect Louise and shepherd her back to Tristane, alive and well. Ooh. Okay, he's asking the salient question, you know, isn't honor a stupid thing to die for? And I guess Saito would say yes, but that's also not what he is dying for after all. You know, the idea is that he's dying to protect Louise. And I don't know, I get it, and I like it, but I feel like it could be a little bit better here. You know, it's one of those things where if he was dying directly to protect her rather than protecting her in this sort of roundabout way, I think it would be a lot better, but, you know, I suppose I'll take what I can get. You know, it is unfortunate they didn't have, like, just one more kiss, because, you know, Louise kind of passed out prior to that, and, Saito just sort of passes her off and heads off, you know. It would have been nice just as, like, a little parting shot, just, you know, one little smooch, even if she isn't strictly, lucid enough to be aware of it. So yeah, already things are grim. You know, Saito is defending the port by himself, seemingly, against those possessed forces, and it's, oh dear. I was gonna say, it's already grim if you're defending a port in the city, but even more grim than that is that, you know, everyone's trying to, like, get Henrietta to stay aboard the ship here. It's like, look, Louise is performing rearguard action. You have to leave, you know, it's a matter of national security. The country will collapse without you. And, you know, that is true. I guess it's one of those things where, you know, the duty of leadership sometimes means you have to do horrible and unsavory things, even if that horrible, unsavory thing is allowing your friend to die when otherwise you would work to prevent that. Of course, you know, as it happens, Henrietta isn't going to have to do that. You know, Louise has been sort of stowed away on a ship. Well, maybe not stowed away in that I feel like no one was trying to prevent her from boarding, but oh dear indeed. So Louise has to be sort of the bearer of bad news here, along with Giulio, that, like, yeah, you know, Saito's performing the rearguard action by himself, and that Louise was brought on their ship by subterfuge, you know. You know, I guess it's nice that I get the distinct impression that Giulio is decidedly unhappy to break this news, because, you know, up until this point, he has seemed to be a fairly unflappable person, you know, generally of good humor no matter the situation, but he is at least appropriately dour in a situation like this, you know. It is the least Saito deserves, even from his perspective, you know, them being allies, but not on remarkably good terms, I guess. So Saito, for his part, seems to have done remarkably well, you know, slaying his way out into the far outskirts of the city again, alone. And I suppose, unfortunately for him, he's reached the army proper. They have artillery emplacements, they have what seem to be like ogres or giants or trolls or something like that, and they've got, approximately 70,000 more people than he has on his side. So, given that the terrain is like fairly wide open, like plains and rolling hills, this really doesn't bode well. Like, I've said it before, but if Saito were in a position to hold like a narrow bridge, he could well do that for a lot longer than he could do something like this, but as the situation stands, with him charging the enemy head on, like, it's almost over before it begins. And really, the only thing that works to his benefit is the fact that he is Gandalfur, and he's got a nifty magic sword. But, it can only last so long against the weight of numbers. Yeah, that's pretty grim, to be, blasted like that with high magic, Because, I recognize we're supposed to understand that this is, medieval combat and all that, but with, I guess, some primitive firearms and artillery and mages, I don't know, I feel like their tactics can afford to be more modern just because they have what is effectively artillery. Man. There's gotta be something especially unsavory about something like this, being pincushioned with arrows when all you have is a sword. Man. Deeply unfair, but, I guess war isn't remarkably known for being fair. So, I guess death is imminent at this point, the wizards are just gonna blow him up, and there's not much he can really do about it, But at the very least, he seems to have captivated the entire army, so, they weren't able to do what they had probably set out to do. Maybe they do want to capture that city of South Gotha, but, it will be perhaps a Pyrrhic victory. Now, with that flower going out, Eclair de Mort, it's pretty certain, Saito is no longer of this world. And I should think it's a heroic end, not necessarily something that anyone would assume he would have ultimately achieved, but, it is still a grim thing. Lest we forget, in this world, familiars are something you're supposed to have for your entire life. I feel like that shot of the headmaster with his little mouse, that wasn't an accident, because he's an old guy, and that mouse has been with him since he was, however old Louise is approximately. I would have hoped that Louise's sisters would have been a wee bit nicer to her. Obviously her one older sister is, but, the slightly younger sister, she's unfortunately sort of pushed her buttons a little bit too much, and I almost would wish Louise would just sort of rely on her violent tendencies now more than usual, just because, screaming at your sisters to get out, that's something, but, I feel for what she said, she probably deserves to be whipped. Now, I do think it is telling that Louise sort of misunderstands everything. She assumes Saito died for her honor, but that's really not true. He died because he loves her and wanted to protect her life. The honor is inconsequential, but I guess he knew it mattered to her. Now this is something. Presumably with that flower lighting up again, that means Saito is back to life. And, normally this would be a very bizarre thing, but, Saito being a legendary familiar and Guiche having mentioned all that monkey business about a fairy bringing him back to life, one has to wonder, right? If a fairy would deign to revive Guiche from death, Surely Saito would be a more deserving target of divine magic like that than anyone. Okay, alright, I'm slightly relieved that everything seems to be proceeding properly. I was briefly concerned that Louise might respond by, slapping him or something just because he has so distraught her by dying, but no, gratifyingly she is appropriately upset and, happy he's alive. Okay. Well, I spoke too soon. I guess he was revived by a fairy, and that the mention of this fairy is enough to upset Louise. I get it. The fairy is absolutely stacked, and, she nursed him back to health and all that, but, man, maybe focus on the salient information that Saito is now alive and well and no longer dead, and that, you were borderline catatonic a moment ago, but I feel like man, Louise is back to normal. It's good, I suppose, but maybe she would do well to be a bit more thankful that she and Saito have seemingly been given a get out of jail free card, if only the one time. Oh dear. So, I reckon we're supposed to find this happy just because, it's like, oh, everything's back to normal, but I feel like being back to normal in this regard is a slight downgrade, Oh dear. So it just never ends, I guess. Saito can't help himself, and, naturally this will lead to Louise not being able to help herself either. Man, we were on the verge of a perfect ending. Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy!